content of the following program, including all statements from the hosts and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by the host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material from this program shall not be viewed as substitute for a personal consultation with an attorney. Now, prepare yourself to be informed and entertained by Gus Bravo and Neil Kotze, two AV-rated trial lawyers who have been practicing law for a combined total of nearly 40 years. For the next 30 minutes, they will share their insight and commentary on important legal issues affecting all of us.
A new client comes into the office of a famous lawyer, and he sits down across from the lawyer. He says, "Can you tell me how much you charge?" And the lawyer looks at him and says, "Of course I can. I charge $300 an hour, or $300 to answer 3 questions." The client looks at him, $300 to answer 3 questions, isn't that a bit steep? The lawyer looks at him and says, "Yes, it is. Now, what's your 3rd question?" I'm Neil Kotze, and with me is Gus Bravo. Welcome to Attorney Confidential with Neil and Gus.
Thank you, Neil. You know, it's funny, I hadn't heard that one before. I've heard a lot of your jokes, but that one I hadn't heard. That's a good one. Welcome to Attorney Confidential. If you want to call in, it's 888-565-1470. You can also listen to us online, live stream at usstream.tv. And also you can listen through the iRadio Now app. And we also have a Facebook page as well,
That's right. And it's very easily named Attorney Confidential, so it shouldn't be too hard to find.
Very, very
with
clever.
Gus and Neil.
Very clever of you. Yeah, we welcome some of your feedback. I think it's important that we want to make this show a little bit more dynamic. So, you know, we're going to have to start forcing friends, families, and uncles to call in. But I think it's important that we get a little bit more feedback as far as what we're doing.
Yes.
Speaking of feedback, I know that your parents have given us some feedback that they want more meat to the show and less jokes.
Right. That's my dad says. We paid for 3 years of law school for you to be a good lawyer, not a good comedian. So, although that doesn't mean we're going to cut the humor out of the show, we had planned on this one to have a little bit more meat, because the one question that, as a lawyer, I'm most frequently asked is, what decision-making process should I go through in hiring a lawyer?
Right.
And we hear that all the time, so we thought today's show would be the do's and don'ts of hiring a lawyer, and what's important, what's not important, things you should be looking for.
By the way, when I was trying to come up with the title, you know, the do's and don'ts, how to actually appropriately put the hyphen and or the apostrophe. Do you know where?
That's what my wife is for. My wife, the journalism major, proofreader, she'll run that by.
So I went to a website, and actually do's is D-O-S, no apostrophe at all. And then don'ts is D-O-N-T, and then apostrophe S. Just a little bit tidbit for those of people.
Well, looking at the way I typed it up, I would get a 0 on the test.
It is completely wrong.
I'm not going to disclose how I typed it up, but I will just say that I got it wrong on both
If
counts.
anyone wants to correct me, feel free. I got that from the internet, so it must be true.
In fact, I kind of wrote don'ts. It looks a lot like donuts, which maybe is a
Freudian slip.
Freudian slip for me. But
so going back to the topic, do's and don'ts, what would be on the top of your list?
Well, there's so many things to think about when hiring an attorney, and we've come up with a list of several things to think about. Whether we get to all of them today or not, I don't know. But the first one I think about is, are you looking for a generalist or a specialist?
Right.
And in Florida, for those of you that aren't listening in Florida, all our fans around in Nebraska and Utah, that are listening in Idaho.
We're big in Idaho.
We are big in Idaho. Well, we should be. I've ordered enough potatoes off my lifetime that they should pay back. But some states allow lawyers to claim specialization. Florida actually has certain certifications, so for some lawyers, you can be certified in certain areas of the law. The question is, do you need that when you're hiring a lawyer or not? And certainly there are certain areas of the law I think it's very important that you get a specialist. Right. Gus and I were talking about the best example that comes to my mind is worker comp.
Right, workers' compensation, OSHA, these are the areas, tax, obviously I think would be areas that you certainly want a lawyer who's had a whole wealth of experience in that. frankly, has only focused on that.
Right.
And it's one of those areas you're either in or out, but you can't have, one foot in and the other one
And whether
doing
they're
something
board
else.
certified or not, it's not critical.
Absolutely.
But I think that that's an added, you pay for that. So it depends on how complicated your issue is.
Right.
But there are certain areas that, there's the old jack of all trades, master of none, and it just depends on the complexity of your issue. Sometimes having the lawyer that knows a lot of areas well, that doesn't necessarily focus on any one, there's a benefit to that.
Sure, because I think in some scenarios, a legal problem is not necessarily a very specific black and white, oh, you need to do this, and that's it. Right. There could be a lot of overlapping areas that touch on, you may have someone that wants to register, has a copyright issue, but they may also have a tax issue, they may also have some corporate issues, they may have some litigation, employment stuff, all wrapped into one. So if you just go to one specialist, they may identify the corporate or the tax, but they may not also pick up on some of the other areas as well.
And that's a very important point. That's one of the things we talked about, differentiation between big firms and small firms. You have firms out there with thousands of lawyers. You have the Holland and Knights of the world, the Jones Days of the world, great law firms. You have firms with 2, 3, you have firms with one lawyer. You have firms with 2,
great
3.
Law firms, no doubt.
Exactly. And some of us in those small firms came from the bigger firms. I would say if you're a Fortune 500 company, again, for all the Fortune 500 executives listening to this show.
You and Idaho.
Are there any Fortune 500 executives who live in Idaho?
Must be the potato guy.
But that's where some of those big firms do have that advantage, is because they have departmentalized and they can cover all your needs.
It's a one-stop shop.
It is a one-stop shop.
Right.
Smaller firms tend to be a little bit more personalized service. In many ways, those of you that choose to bank at a Wachovia versus a mom-and-pop bank, it's kind of a similar analogy. There are times when going to that smaller environment has its pluses and minuses. And it's something that analysis to go through. There's no right or wrong answer there. It depends on your particular needs.
Yeah, I would give the analogy of a hospital and maybe a general practitioner of a doctor. At the hospital, you're going to have every specialty in one place. You go to your local hometown doctor, he or she is just going to have one general area. But they're a good frontline person to visit.
And there's times when it's important to go to the Mayo Clinic.
Right.
And there are times when you really don't need that, because you always pay more for that Mayo Clinic.
You can go to the walk-in clinic and be diagnosed with just
exactly
other issues. To me, the one thing that I wanted when I was trying to make my list as well, I thought of it's the businessman versus the old school lawyer, and by that what I meant was there's a lot of very good business folks in the practice of law right now. They're able to make a lot of money doing creative, whether it's the jingles or the billboards, and credit to them. But they may not necessarily be the best lawyers. They're just the ones that are out front and center. Versus we've seen a lot of other lawyers that we've gone against and litigated against, and maybe co-counseled cases, are exceptional attorneys. But you would never hear of them, never find them on a website, or I don't want to age myself, or you for that matter, the Yellow Pages.
The worldwide interweb.
Exactly, Al Gore's web. But I think the idea is those folks may not be very good business people because they just don't know how to get their name out to the masses. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're not good lawyers. Quite the opposite. They may be exceptional lawyers. You just got to be able to find them.
And that goes along a point that you and I have talked about is how do you find a lawyer? There are various search engines for that. Google. That would be my first choice. But there are sites for that. But in some ways, I think the best way to find a lawyer is no different than the best way that many of you would find your doctors and other professionals, and that's word of mouth.
Absolutely.
And that goes for the specialists too, because if you have a friend who's a lawyer who may not, for example, workers' comp, if you have a friend who's a lawyer and you know that they don't do workers' comp, but you need a workers' compensation lawyer, then I would still go to your friend who's a lawyer, because we have ways, there's email sites that we can go to where we can email 1,000 lawyers in the Broward area, for example, to find out who knows a good workers' comp lawyer, and then we find out. So
there's really no substitute. Sorry to interrupt. There's no substitute for word of mouth.
Right.
I think we can all agree. Doesn't matter the doctor or the mechanic or whoever. You want to rely on your inner circle of folks that whom you trust. If they've had an experience, a positive experience or a negative experience with a particular professional, and it's no different for lawyers. And I think it's a good indicator. And I would say it's probably a better indicator than any kind of marketing, self-promotion you're going to find from that attorney. Anyone can pay a lot of money to do a fancy website, really cool video, get on the radio, for example, and talk about how wonderful they may be, which we're not going to try to do in this show. But the idea is go by what other people are telling you what their experience was like. It doesn't mean it's going to necessarily be the same way, but it's a pretty good indicator of
just
what
be
that
careful.
profession will be like.
If you have friends that have 20 lawyers, then you might want to reevaluate your choice of friends, especially if you find out that 19 of them are criminal defense lawyers. But nonetheless, I think it's still the friends that you trust. These are people that you've put your trust in. And other business people, even if they're not friends per se, but people that you know in the business world. Your doctor. Just be careful when you ask your doctor if he knows a good lawyer, because he's going to start thinking that you're looking for med mal.
What's the next item on your list?
Well, one of the things I think in the do's and don'ts, and I think it's one of the mistakes a lot of people make, at least when people have inquired of me and friends, is the hourly rate, which is actually why I led with the hourly rate and billing joke.
So there was a symmetry there.
I try. If those of you have watched the first two shows, you will hopefully notice
that watch all three.
Well, for the other 6 people who may have watched them, I do try to make my opening joke somewhat related to the topic we're going to discuss, and we could go back and revisit that someday and see if I did a good job at that. But in all seriousness, you have to be careful when a lawyer tells you how they're going to charge. Most lawyers, if you need a defense lawyer, somebody to defend you in a case, and you're not seeking damages, is going to charge you by the hour. And if you go to 2 or 3 lawyers, and one lawyer says, I'm going to charge you $250 an hour, and another one says they're going to charge you $500 an hour, don't necessarily, this is the mistake a lot of people make, is they necessarily go, well, geez, 250, I'm going with the 250 guy. Now, that may not be the wrong decision. But remember, lawyers charge higher rates sometimes because of their level of experience. Between Gus and I, we're almost at 40 years. If you took a lawyer that had 40 years of experience versus a lawyer that had 4 years of experience, there are certain tasks that more senior, I'll use that phrase, more senior lawyer would be able to do in an hour that the more junior lawyer might take 3 or 4 hours to do. So even though you're getting a lower hourly rate, the $250 an hour lawyer would charge you $1,000 for what the $500 hour lawyer would charge you $500. So hourly rates are relative.
Yeah, and I would add, sometimes those have nothing to do with value. A lot of times what lawyers charge for hourly rate is really based on what they think the market is willing to pay them. Which we do it all, from the business perspective, an hourly rate should really represent the cost of the lawyer to do that business, coupled with the experience that the lawyer brings to the table and the efficiency.
And we're getting now in an era where lawyers are charging more flat fees and fixed rates for things. So it's not the hourly rate that matters as much as the budget. If you're charging, if you've got a lawyer that you want to bring in for an hourly matter, and that lawyer quotes you the rate, the next question you have to ask them is, well, what's the budget for these tasks? What's it going to take to to respond to the complaint? What's it going to take for the 5 depositions you told me are going to be in this case, and get a flat fee?
Yeah, it's difficult sometimes to budget, but you should, especially litigation. There's so many unknown variables, but you must insist that your lawyer give you at least a good faith budget of what he or she thinks it's going to cost. I mean, it can't just be, there's a big difference between $10,000 and $100,000. Right. And litigation can be very, very expensive. So I think your point is well taken. It's not simply about hourly rate. It's not simply about how much the experience, but really overall budget.
And that's very, I mean, we can go and talk about this issue for a while, but I'm looking at the clock now. We're actually at the midway point, and I think it's time for our midway break. And then we will come back shortly after that and continue discussing the do's and don'ts of hiring a lawyer.
Right. You're listening to Attorney Confidential with Gus and Neil, and the second half of the show, we'll talk a little bit more about the do's and don'ts.
Attorney Confidential with Gus and Neil is being brought to you by the law offices of Neil D. Kodzing and Bravo Law. Bravo Law is a business litigation firm known for providing common-sense solutions to small businesses and individuals throughout South Florida. Mr. Bravo is rated AV by Martindale-Hubbell and Superb by AVVO. the highest ratings available from these two entities. The law offices of Neil D. Conci is the litigation boutique with offices in Broward and Miami-Dade counties. Mr. Conci is a veteran trial lawyer with nearly 25 years of jury trial experience. He is also a two-time recipient of the South Florida Daily Business Review's Most Effective Lawyer Award, a recipient of numerous awards for providing pro bono legal services, and has been recognized by the National Law Council. Call our office, 786-464-0841 or 954-790-6711, and get informed. You're listening to Attorney Confidential with Gus and Neil. If you have a comment, question, or just want to contribute to the conversation, call the show at 888-565-1470 and share your thoughts on what's going on. Now, back to Gus and Neil for more Attorney Confidential.
Welcome back to Attorney Confidential with Gus and Neil. The first half hour of the show, or not half hour, but the first half of the show.
Just felt like a half hour.
Yeah, it's
hopefully those of you listening, it didn't feel like a half hour.
your parents.
Right.
We've been talking about the do's and don'ts of hiring a lawyer. Before we get into it, if you want to touch base with us, we already gave the number, but we'll do so again, 1-888-565-1470. For those of you watching us online, hello, Alex, Sophie, and Ruby, or Lubinka.
Samantha Claris.
You can also visit our Facebook page and post comments. We welcome your feedback about the things we're doing right and maybe their own version of the do's and don'ts.
Exactly. Yeah, the do's and don'ts of Attorney Confidential. Please respond immediately.
So before the break, we were talking about some of the do's and don'ts. We got into generalists or specialists, the hourly rate, business versus old school lawyer. I know, Neil, you have a couple. What are some of the other do's and don'ts?
The next most common one I get when people call, are you a pit bull, are you aggressive? And I have a fairly standard answer for that is I'm capable of being as aggressive as I need to be, but you don't want a pit bull.
Right. And why is that?
Because for those of you who've seen the movie Spinal Tap, I'm aging myself, Gus, but there's a great scene in that movie where they talk about the speaker system, the stereo system, where the speakers go to 11. And you don't want, you want a lawyer who's capable of going to 11 in the volume, breaking that 10. But you don't want them hovering there the entire time. and we have gone up against so many lawyers who they don't know anything other than 9, 10, and 11 on their volume control. And after a while, judges see through that. Other lawyers see through that, and you know how to deal with that. You want somebody that can be a 1 and be an 11 and know when to be a 1 and when to be an 11.
Absolutely. Look, they're not preaching to the choir. I mean, when a lawyer calls us and is overly aggressive and threatening, we're not going to fall prey to some of those tactics because we know really what the rules are and obviously how to play that game. So I think all that does, I know the reaction that we often get is it just further entrenches us in the position. It's going to ensure litigation is going to last longer. Lasting longer means it's going to be more costly to the client.
9 times out of 10, you catch more flies with sugar than you do with poison.
That's the first time I've heard you say that.
You've heard that 9 times out of 10 from me. I hope
the sarcasm came through.
It certainly came through to me. Whether it came through to anybody else, I don't know.
Well, I was just meeting with clients today, and I told them that it was vinegar and honey. And I said, lawyers oftentimes, unfortunately, we're vinegar. And certainly when a lawyer gets overly aggressive, they're not doing their clients any service. It really should be a profession where you're trying to zealously advocate your client's position, but do so in a professional manner.
And that's a critical word because the bar actually requires us under our oath to zealously represent our client, and that's the word.
Is that the little thing framed we have all of us hanging on the wall, and no one ever reads?
I think zealously is a much better word than aggressively. Right. Because zealously means you know when to be aggressive, when not to be aggressive. Sometimes you can accomplish things as a good negotiator that don't require you to get in someone's face. And I'm also, and a lot of other lawyers are certified mediators. And so I get to see both sides of the equation from sitting in the middle between the two lawyers and also from being one of the advocates.
We've had the advantage of working with some really exceptional attorneys. I think we would agree. And I think the common denominator is they're extremely prepared, never underestimated their opponent, and I thought were aggressive when they needed to be, but knew also how to play almost the role of mediator, the sort of work in tandem with the other side to try to get a deal done. I know you've heard this all the time because we do mediations, but when they say what's the formula for a settlement, it's when the guy who's going to write the check, right, pays a little bit more than he or she was willing to pay, and the person who's going to receive it is taking a little less than he or she was willing to take.
Well, yeah, because having gone through the number of trials we've gone through, and other lawyers too, usually the client's only been through one trial or no trials, unless they're a corporate client with a lot of experience, and so they realize once they get into the thick of things, they'd like this to end much quicker.
Right.
I want to take this all the way to trial.
And I have to tell you, there's nothing like sometimes just picking up the phone and just calling the other side and saying, what are we doing?
What's it going to take?
What's it going to take? I remember when I started practicing law, I had a case, I'm not going to name names, of course, but where my client was, the defendant was in the wrong, and the plaintiff wanted 75, and we put 25,000 on the table. They wanted 75,000, and I had these wonderful legal arguments, and we spent a lot of time developing them, and got 4 out of the 5 counts that they had dismissed. And after $10,000-$15,000 spending money, guess where we settled? 50, of course, the middle point. I could have just picked up the phone and called and say, "You want to split the baby? Sorry," but I mean that should happen more, and it doesn't happen enough.
Right. No, and I've settled more cases pre-suit now because I sit down with the other lawyer and say, let's just go grab a beer and talk about the
Absolutely.
case. And I think in many ways that professionalism between lawyers is not as frequent as I'd like to see
Well,
it.
they used to go, maybe in your time, but certainly, unfortunately, it wasn't in my time, but apparently judges, lawyers, after coming out a full day of trial, would walk across the street and literally go to the bar and drink and talk about, not obviously share any attorney-client confidentiality, but just, again, talk about their day, talk about whatever, but it was very cordial. Ironically enough, I see a lot more of that in the criminal defense or the criminal system.
The
than
civil
the
system is. It's funny because my first experience when I was in law school, I got to clerk for a judge, Judge Greason in North Carolina, who was actually one of the prosecutors for the Greensboro Klan case back in the 80s. And I was sitting in my first ever trial with him, and I watched the prosecutor and the defense lawyer just argue and argue and argue, never at each other,
Right.
but passionately about their case. And the judge called me into chambers, and he said, "Well, what did you think about the case?" I said, "Well, those two lawyers hate each other." And he just started laughing. And he looked at me and he said, "What are you doing now? Do you have dinner plans?" And I said, "No." And he said, "You want to join me for dinner?" And great, I get to go to dinner with the judge. We drove a couple miles, pulled into a restaurant bar. There was the defense lawyer, the prosecutor, and the judge. They were all meeting for dinner and drinks afterwards. And I realized it was a valuable lesson.
Absolutely. And that's the way it should be. Unfortunately, I think a lot more deals would get done and in turn save clients a lot of money if you have that approach. And so it's important for clients to understand when you're going to meet with an attorney, it's not simply about all these other factors or the pit bull, how aggressive can you be? There's a time and place for it. And frankly, some would argue there's really never a time to be a pit bull, right? I mean, there's a time to be aggressive, right. But pit bull has a connotation to be overly aggressive.
You can be aggressive with a smile. I remember one time I stole this from another lawyer, but I had a witness who just wasn't going to answer a question for me on cross-examination, and I finally turned to him and I said, "The chair you're sitting in is brown, correct?" There's an objection. What's the relevance? And I just finally, I turned to the judge in front of the jury and says, "Your Honor, I just wanted to see if he could answer one question with a simple yes." I learned that judges didn't appreciate that, but that's going after somebody.
But I think it dovetails nicely to the next do's and don'ts that I had, which is a personality fit. Look, you're picking a professional. You're picking someone who's going to be your guide, if you will, through what can be a very stressful situation. Unfortunately, when you find yourself embroiled in some kind of legal case, whether someone owes you money, you owe them money, you've suffered a loss, a personal injury, whatever it may be, I can assure you it's going to be stressful. And so you want to make sure whoever you're hiring as your attorney that you feel comfortable with that person. And to me, personality, I would put it at the very top of meet that person in obviously person at their office, see how they interact with their staff, see how comfortable you feel. It's just like picking a doctor, right?
No, I think that's very important. I mean, Gus, on the last show, you mentioned that there are 86,000 and some odd lawyers in Florida.
And counting.
And we joked
growing.
about how a lot of people think that might be too many. But in all seriousness, again, if there's that many lawyers out there, don't jump to the first one that you find. If you're not comfortable with a lawyer for any of the reasons we've talked about today, it's like doctors, get a second opinion. Go to a second lawyer or a third lawyer. In fact, I now have a practice in which when someone comes to me for a plaintiff's matter, I do not have them sign a retainer agreement during that meeting. I refuse to let them. I say, no, I want to give you an opportunity to see if you want to look at other lawyers. I will email you the retainer agreement within 3 days if you call me back and ask for it. If it's a defense case, then you don't have to have the whole detailed signer. It's more like a letter. So
Which is funny. It's an example of bad business, right? Because,
it's terrible business.
From a business perspective,
you want to grab that case immediately, but that's just not how.
It's the Alec Baldwin, the ABC. You know what I'm talking about? The ABC, always be closing.
Right.
And so lawyers who are a lot more business savvy than you and I will say, close them. Get the deal, get the signature, finish it right away. And so I think it's important, though, because look, we've learned that it's a two-way street. And so a client that comes to us and maybe is going to hire us without really thinking it through, and if our personalities don't match, ultimately that's going to become an issue. Because at the end of the day, the very fabric of an attorney-client relationship is trust. It's confidence, right? You have to have the confidence in your lawyer. It's got to be a two-way street. You have to be able to tell him or her everything.
Right. And
when it comes to your
confidence,
case,
the one thing I will say from the lawyers looking back at the clients, and Gus knows we've had this situation recently, is do us all a favor. Not that we have gigantic egos, although we do, but don't play lawyer with us.
Give a guy a rope and he thinks he's a cowboy.
Right. Have the confidence in your lawyer. If you don't have enough confidence in your lawyer that you feel you need to educate them about the law, or you need to Google the law and tell them what they're missing, get a different lawyer.
Right.
Because if you really feel that you need to do that, you have the wrong lawyer. Because you should never have to feel like you have to get on Google or do whatever to find what the law is and call your lawyer up. It's just like I get a kick out of all these pharmaceutical ads on TV where people are going to advise their doctors what medication they should be prescribed. You don't see lawyer ads on TV educating you to tell your lawyer what legal argument they should make. So I would say that's something try to avoid, only because it just doesn't accomplish anything.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, you want to be, you want to play a role. I mean, we always try to tell clients, look, we need you, we need to rely on you. It's a team effort, but I'm the lawyer of the client. And so you have to have that confidence. If you're going to be looking over our shoulders every time, I think you're absolutely right. Get a different lawyer.
Now, it's a little different with me and Gus because I'm constantly looking over Gus's shoulder, but that's a separate issue.
It's Gus and I, by the way.
Oh, jeez. Now my wife is going to get really angry at my grammar.
I think we're coming down to a close again. So before we do our closing remarks, or my closing remarks, I wanted to just kind of give you an opportunity to do a takeaway from today of what folks who are too lazy to watch the whole show, and what one takeaway they can have.
The quick takeaway
10
is
seconds.
You have time to be selective when choosing a lawyer. There are 86,000 of us in Florida. Other states may have more. So be selective. Follow some of the advice we've given you. Look for what you truly need and make sure you get a good personality fit.
Okay. And so now we close with our one deep thought comment of the day. And for those of you looking online, hopefully you'll be able to see our really cool picture of the deep thought. Doesn't seem to be coming on. Oh, there it is. Perfect. Well, this came from good old Bill Shakespeare, or otherwise known as William Shakespeare, who said, "Better a witty fool than a foolish wit."
Which reminds me, I'll have to add to that sometimes it's better to keep your mouth shut and remain thoughtful than to open it and remove all doubt.
Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
Thank you.
On that note, thank you, everybody.
Tune in next week to Attorney Confidential with Gus and Neil.
Thanks.
You have been listening to Attorney Confidential with Gus Bravo and Neil Kotze, two rated AV trial attorneys with over 40 years of experience. Tune in next week for another episode of entertainment, insight, and just plain fun. That's Monday, 6 p.m. on WNN, 1470 AM. See you next Monday for more Attorney Confidential. The opinions expressed on the preceding sponsored program were strictly those of its host, guests,